Welcome, everyone. I'm Brent Carbajal. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to another installment of the Dean's Lecture Series. I think we have a very interesting and compelling talk to enjoy this evening. Before we get started, I want to make a couple of comments about this series and acknowledge and thank some people. This is a speaker series that's really sponsored by the Dean's Fund for Excellence in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And if you'd like to know more about that fund, Angie Vandenhoek is here, sitting over here in the corner. She's our gift officer, and she'd be happy to talk with you about it. But I also just want to thank Katrina Schaefer, who has now departed for home, and Leanne Martin, who's the Associate Dean in the college, Catherine Shornick in the college for their help in getting this all set up. It's some coordination needs to take place. I also want to thank the city for their partnership and for allowing us to use this beautiful venue, and TV10 as well for their willingness to film this and broadcast it. So if you miss something this evening, you can always see it on TV later. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Karlberg. Dr. Karlberg received his PhD in communication from Simon Fraser University and has been a faculty member at Western since 1997. He has an impressive record of teaching and scholarship, receives accolades in both areas. His research and writing focus is on the relationship between communication, culture, and conflict, and he's the author of the book, Beyond the Culture of Contest, From Adversarialism to Mutualism in an Age of Interdependence. We have a copy of that book outside. A frequent presenter at international conferences in his field, he's a sought-after speaker on any number of topics pertaining to communication, media literacy, and global citizenship. The title of Dr. Karlberg's presentation this evening is Denial of Education as a Strategy of Oppression, Examining Human Rights Abuses in Iran. I think you'll find Dr. Karlberg's approach to this topic to be very compelling, not only for the importance of his subject, but also for the informed context with which he frames his analysis of oppression in Iran. You've come tonight to listen to Dr. Karlberg, so you don't want to hear any more from me. I'm going to sit down and turn it over to him. When we finish, there will be a little bit of time for questions. Because this is filmed, we need you to talk into the microphone when you ask questions, and we'll pass the microphone around down here. If you are seated up there, please go to the microphone in the corner. But if you ask a question and you're not on the mic, it won't go over on TV. So, thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Can people hear me all right? Okay. So, the subject I'm going to be speaking about is kind of a sensitive, delicate subject in many ways. And I want to preface my actual presentation just with a few brief comments so that nobody leaves with a sort of misunderstanding of my intent or what I'm saying. The first thing I want to emphasize is that there's a lot of saber rattling going on in American political discourse right now about Iran. And nothing I say should be interpreted as, support for this sort of bomb Iran campaigns that we hear about and these sorts of things. That is not in any way my intention. I also want to emphasize that you shouldn't interpret anything I say as a criticism of either the Iranian people or of Islam. The Iranian people are wonderful people with a very rich and beautiful history and amazingly good food and many other things. And Islam itself, when it's disentangled from some of the sort of political forces that have attached to it at times, is a fundamentally progressive and peaceful religion that, among other things, largely gave birth to the European Enlightenment and even the institution of the modern university where I work today. So my critique is really directed specifically at a very small power elite in Iran today. that has manufactured a very toxic combination of politics and religion that most people in Iran today find oppressive. So this is not in any way an attack on Iranian culture, civilization, or Islam. Finally, I want to say that my presentation is going to focus most specifically on the acute oppression of the Baha'i community in Iran. And I speak on this subject both as an academic that studied it, but also as a Baha'i. And some people, when they hear that, might have concerns about my ability to speak about this topic objectively. So I want to address those concerns up front as well. I want to address it by pointing out that all scholarship comes from some perspective or some social position. And some scholarship necessarily comes from the position of an insider, someone inside a community that is being studied. The best scholarship is transparent in its perspective or its position, and can also be corroborated by others from other perspectives. So, no one today would advance the claim that women shouldn't be studying women's issues because they're insiders. That would be an absurd claim. Similarly, no one would advance the claim that African Americans should not be entitled to study the African American experience because they're insiders. That would be an equally absurd claim. What we expect is transparency and the ability of others to corroborate one's findings. So in this context, my research, my scholarship comes from the position of a Baha'i, but it's corroborated by many neutral third-party observers, and it's also been published in various peer-reviewed journals and gone through that process of review as well. A couple of my articles were out on the table, as well as a book I wrote. If you're interested in delving more deeply into anything I say tonight, I would refer you to those sources. And on the handout, there's information about how you could download either of those articles, or if you're interested, purchase the book. So, on that note, let me begin by providing a sort of overview of the situation of the Baha'is in Iran. The Baha'is in Iran have been the targets of recurrent waves of persecution for over 150 years. In that time, over 20,000 Baha'is have been executed, often in very brutal ways. In 1979, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the new regime that came to power, a new wave of persecution was unleashed. Very quickly, hundreds of Baha'is were rounded up, executed, or disappeared. Thousands of Baha'is were imprisoned, arrested, tortured. Tens of thousands of Baha'is lost their homes, their properties, their income, their pensions, their livelihood. Baha'is were declared unprotected infidels in the country, which meant that legally anyone could commit any crime against Baha'is with legal impunity. All Baha'is in Iran have been systematically vilified through the media and from the pulpit. The names and locations of Baha'is have been systematically gathered for police records. Authorities routinely come to their homes in the middle of the night to search or arrest them. Baha'i grave sites are systematically bulldozed and desecrated. Baha'i children are the targets of state-sponsored intimidation in elementary and middle and high schools. And Baha'i youth of university age are denied all access to higher education as part of a state-sponsored program to block the progress, social and economic progress of the Baha'i community. All of this has been well documented by human rights organizations, the United Nations, and many other third-party observers. Now, I'm going to return to this denial of education in a minute. As a person who's devoted my life to higher education, this is a particularly salient and relevant sort of aspect of this persecution to me, and one of the reasons we're here tonight. But first, I need to provide also a little more context. So, in order to justify the wide range of abuses and human rights violations against the Iranian Baha'is, the government in Iran has manufactured a series of baseless and often self-contradictory accusations against the Baha'is. I won't go into all those now. They've been sort of thoroughly addressed and rebutted by many authors, again, outside the Baha'i community as well as in. But all neutral observers agree that the only reason the Baha'is are actually persecuted in Iran is because of their beliefs. So let me quickly sketch some of those beliefs so that you can understand the nature of this persecution. You know, the fundamental belief of the Baha'i community is that humanity has entered an age of ever-increasing interdependence on a global scale, and that really our primary challenge at this moment in history is to recognize and accept the oneness of humanity, and to translate that recognition into a social order that embodies that concept. Baha'is also believe in the full harmony of science and religion. They're obedient to the laws of the lands in which they live. They don't proselytize their beliefs or impose them on others. They organize their internal affairs without any clergy through a unique democratic system of self-governance. They believe that education is the key to human progress. They believe in the full equality of men and women, and they place the highest priority on the education of girls. So in fact, about a century ago, the Baha'i community began to create the first schools for girls in modern Iran. Before that, there was no opportunity for formal education. It was open not only to Baha'i children, but to girls of all faiths or none. These schools raised up the first generation of professional women in Iran. And as a result of their success, they were forcibly shut down by the government in the early 20th century. But the Baha'i community found other ways to educate its own girls, and by 1974, it had achieved 100% female literacy rate in a country that at the same time had only a 15% female literacy rate. So these beliefs and practices that I'm describing are the reasons the Baha'is are persecuted in Iran. Evidence for this is found most clearly in the fact that the authorities consistently offer the Baha'is a reprieve from torture or execution if they will only renounce their beliefs. This is why the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center has described the persecution of the Baha'is as, quote, in their words, reminiscent of the methods of the Spanish Inquisition. And the motives behind the persecution are quite clear. The religious power elite in Iran feel threatened by the mere existence of the Baha'is. This is because the interpretation, and this is a very narrow and extreme interpretation of Islam that is propagated by the ruling clergy in Iran, cannot admit the possibility of a post-Islamic religion, especially one that is attractive to other Iranians because of its progressive teachings, and thus threatens to undermine the clergy's grip on the Iranian psyche, along with their privileged social and economic position, and the extensive system of financial endowments that supports it. This is why the Baha'is have suffered 150 years of persecution in Iran. Now, what I focus on in my scholarship is not the persecution, but the Baha'i response to this persecution. Because the Baha'is have developed a very unique, not only nonviolent, but entirely non-adversarial response to oppression and injustice. So think about it this way. We're all familiar, of course, with the long human history of violent revolution, violent strategies of social change. We've also seen nonviolent strategies of civil disobedience and organized opposition of various kinds throughout the 20th century that have achieved various degrees of success. We can think of, for instance, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, or the many expressions of the current Arab Spring today, which are pursuing nonviolent forms of social change. But Baha'is believe that actually in this age of ever-increasing interdependence, other strategies are not only possible, but are imperative. So Baha'is are exploring what you could think of as a third model of social change, which I refer to in my own scholarship as a model of constructive resilience. Now, within this approach, all of the community's energy is focused on unifying and constructive work, oriented towards the advancement of the entire nation. So, the establishment of schools for girls is just one of the many examples of what I'm talking about. Now, as Baha'is are pursuing this work, if they encounter violent persecution, they adopt a posture of constructive resilience. In other words, they continue their constructive efforts in the most resilient and resourceful ways they can, meeting persecution with patience, appealing for justice through whatever legal channels are available to them, and inviting the world to observe the injustices that are being committed against them. In these ways, the Baha'i community in Iran has never let their oppressors establish the terms of the encounter. They've refused to play the role of the victim, refused to be dehumanized, refused to compromise their principles, and refused to forfeit their sense of constructive agency. One of the clearest examples of this constructive resilience can be seen in the way the Baha'i community responded to the denial of higher education to its youth. So when Baha'i youth were systematically expelled from universities and then denied future admission, rather than take to the streets in protest, rather than engage in acts of civil disobedience, or pick up arms, the Baha'is simply began the work of constructing a decentralized university that they operate out of their own homes, their living rooms, their kitchens, and over the internet, so that Baha'i youth could continue to pursue their higher education. This university, which is called the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education, now offers over 1,000 courses that span the social sciences, and humanities, and leads to over 17 different bachelor's degrees and 10 graduate degrees. Graduates from this university who have been able to leave Iran have been accepted into top graduate programs, including Harvard and many others, in the United States and elsewhere because of the quality and rigor of these degrees. In response, the authorities in Iran have mounted several efforts to crack down on this university. They've raided Baha'i homes in which it operates, confiscated educational materials that it relies on, and arrested students and faculty in successive waves. The most recent wave of these arrests occurred just this year, and a number of Baha'is were recently handed 3-, 4-, and 5-year prison sentences for either pursuing education or for teaching those who were. But the Baha'i University survives. And the Baha'i community continues its constructive work not only through the university, but also in neighborhoods and villages around the country, where Baha'is continue to find a range of ways to serve the social and economic needs of the neighborhoods, villages, communities in which they live, while maintaining a posture of resilience when they're attacked or imprisoned for this work. Now, meanwhile, Iranians from all backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, Zoroastrian, Jew, are recognizing the innocence of the Baha'is and beginning to speak out on their behalf, often at great personal risk. Likewise, reporters, foreign governments, human rights organizations from around the world are paying increasing attention to the situation of the Baha'is in Iran and are also speaking out on their behalf. One notable example of this is the open letter that was recently written by two Nobel Peace Prize recipients, Desmond Tutu and Jose Ramos Horta, and you have a copy of that letter on the handout that you were given. Now, although this letter is addressed specifically to the international academic community, and it appeals to academics everywhere to speak out on behalf of the right to higher education, the letter also corroborates the claims I've been making in this presentation. Another notable example of observers speaking out on behalf of the Baha'is in Iran is a documentary that was recently released by Jeff Kaufman, who has done many documentaries for Amnesty International. After learning about the denial of higher education to the Baha'is in Iran, he took it upon himself to produce a documentary entitled Education Under Fire. And this documentary actually screened twice during the Bellingham Human Rights Film Festival this winter. Some of you might have had an opportunity to see it. But Kaufman went beyond that, and he and some collaborators also created an online campaign at educationunderfire.com. Again, the details are in your handout, to further shine a spotlight on the situation of the Baha'is of Iran. The website so far has gathered almost 25,000 petitions that have been sent directly to authorities in Iran protesting concern about the denial of higher education to Baha'is. So, shining a spotlight on human rights abuses, we need to understand, is a very powerful means of deterring further abuses. Tyranny hates daylight. And in this age of increasing global interconnectivity, it's possible for the first time in human history to do this everywhere on the planet. This is one of the unique characteristics of the time in which we live. This is in part what Baha'is recognize and what enables them to pursue this third model, this strategy of constructive resilience. But in the process, the Baha'i community is not only modeling a non-adversarial response to injustice, they're also contributing to the gradual maturation of the global human rights discourse itself, and beyond that, to a rising global consciousness of the oneness of humanity, which is the Baha'i community's fundamental reason for existence. Also, it's worth noting on a purely pragmatic level, many observers believe that genocide against the Iranian Baha'is has been averted because of this strategy. In fact, an international organization called the Sentinel Project for Genocide Prevention, which arose after the horrendous experience in Rwanda that most of you remember. This organization studied genocides throughout the 20th century and came up with a set of indicators that signal pre-genocidal movements within a state, so that the international community could be better positioned to try and avert them. Almost all of the indicators they came up with are present in the case of the Baha'is in Iran. One of these indicators, interestingly enough, is the denial of education. which was a precursor to the Holocaust, to the Armenian genocide, and to other similar experiences in the 20th century. So the Baha'is may well have already been the victim of a full-scale genocidal campaign if it had not been for the strategy they adopted, which has denied the regime any pretext for an all-out assault, has fostered growing sympathy and moral support from non-Baha'i Iranians, has attracted the support of a growing chorus of outside observers. And the authorities in Iran are sensitive to these things. This is why the Baha'i community in Iran has been identified by one genocide scholar, Friedrich F. Halter, as, in his words, one of the few documented cases of a minority that has managed to peacefully resist a sustained and systematic campaign of genocidal intent. Now, in this context, my own scholarship has sought to model the Baha'i response to oppression, along with the Baha'i community's, frankly, radical approach to social change, in that it's change directed at the deepest roots of the prevailing social order. In my work, I acknowledge that nonviolent opposition and civil disobedience certainly represent a significant advancement over violent strategies of social change that many of us have come to abhor. But nonviolent opposition and civil disobedience, despite the important short-term victories they've often led to, have, in my opinion, reached a point of diminishing returns because they fail to address the underlying sources or causes of injustice and oppression. Injustice and oppression ultimately flow from a failure to recognize our organic interdependence, or a failure to recognize that the interests of every individual and group are inextricably linked, and a failure to translate this recognition into a more just and sustainable social order based on a commitment to our shared interests and our common humanity. This is the underlying solution to injustice and oppression. Now, of course, I've encountered many people who believe that this view or this expectation is naive and unrealistic. But I argue that the truly naive and unrealistic expectation or position is to assume that humanity can continue much longer on its present path of identity group conflict and interest group competition. Ultimately, of course, there's only one way to find out if our species is capable of recognizing its common human identity and embracing its shared interests. One has to test the hypothesis by committing to it and seeing what fruit it bears. Baha'is, along with countless others in the world today, are doing precisely this, committing to the oneness of humanity in order to see what fruit it will bear. Now, in this regard, the Baha'i community can be understood really as a vast social experiment. And its approach to social change offers a very valuable heuristic or a framework for inquiry that opens up some very exciting, significant lines of learning. Among the insights that are suggested by this heuristic and that I explore in my work, I want to touch briefly on 4, which I elaborate specifically in the article entitled Constructive Resilience, if you're interested in delving more deeply into this. So first, this heuristic, or this framework for inquiry that's suggested by the Baha'i approach to social change, it suggests that as long as underlying identities and interests remain in conflict, strategies of nonviolent opposition will ultimately be countered by increasingly sophisticated strategies of nonviolent oppression. And I believe that's what we're seeing in the world today in many forms. So for instance, think about the civil rights movement in this country, which employed methods of nonviolent opposition and civil disobedience, won some significant victories. But in its legacy, we see institutionalized racism and many other oppressive social structures and norms that can only be eradicated by addressing the underlying interests and identities that I'm alluding to. Another insight that this framework for inquiry suggests is that as long as underlying interests and identities remain in conflict, even relatively successful strategies of nonviolent opposition tend to merely result in the transference of oppression to others. So an example one could look to here is the example of many first world labor movements, which again, despite the important accomplishments they've achieved and the praiseworthy nonviolent methods they've employed, have in the final analysis frequently transferred their own oppression onto other distant, even less enfranchised people, often in other countries, through trade barriers and other protectionist policies and other outcomes that appear to those who have struggled for them to be local victories, but in fact reflect the transference of oppression onto distant others. The third insight that this framework for inquiry suggests is that opposition to oppressive institutions in fact diverts time and energy away from the construction of alternative institutional forms. Because when oppressive systems are thrown off by nonviolent opposition movements, a vacuum is left that creates a rush to power among competing interest groups, which merely invites new forms of oppression. We saw this a half a century ago following the nonviolent independence struggle in India, which was immediately followed by the most horrendous bloodbath on the Indian subcontinent in anyone's memory because of this rush for power. And I believe we're seeing signs of it again today in the nonviolent Arab Spring movements, which is not a criticism of those movements. My point is that such strategies have reached a point of diminishing returns, and we need to begin seeking other strategies. So the fourth and final insight that this framework suggests is that oppositional models of social change, however nonviolent, may ultimately be self-defeating within what I call the Western liberal culture of contest, in which almost every major social institution is structured as a formalized contest of power. And so we look around us and we see partisan contests in our political arena, advocacy contests in our legal arena, contests of capital accumulation in our education or in our economic arena, grade-based contests in our educational arena, physical or mental contests in the arenas of recreation and leisure. And in all of these cases, competitive expressions of power determine the winners and losers. How could it be otherwise? This is the nature of a contest. So those who enter the contests with the most power at the outset ultimately tend to prevail. This is a theme I explore in much greater depth in my book, but in the context of my discussion tonight, I only want to point out that oppositional models of social change are in fact an expression of the culture of contest, not its solution. I believe they'll ultimately be self-defeating because contests of power inherently privilege dominant social groups, which is the cause of the perpetuation of injustice. The injustices that result when every social institution is structured in this way are largely what lead people to engage in the oppositional strategies themselves. Ironically, no matter how nonviolent those oppositional responses are, they're still an extension of the prevailing culture of contest. And in this regard, oppositional strategies, I argue, ultimately perpetuate the hegemony of the culture of contest itself. This is because oppositional strategies, among other things, reflect and reinforce those assumptions about human nature and about the social order that buttress the culture of contest. Hence the paradox of protest in a culture of contest, which is the title of another article I've written on this. But if we view the world through this lens for a moment, which I realize may be a fairly radical way of thinking about the world we've all been raised in, but after all, isn't that the goal of a liberal education? To liberate our minds from the cage of inherited ways of thinking? If we view the world through the lens I'm offering in this analysis, I believe we can see that growing numbers of people appear to be intuitively recognizing many of these dynamics and searching for alternatives, both to the culture of contest and to the culture of protest that surrounds it. Baha'is are among those many people who are seeking these alternatives. The experience of the Baha'i community in Iran, I believe, offers an especially salient case study in this regard, because the Baha'is in Iran have been pursuing this work under the most hostile conditions possible. And if their strategy works there, it should work anywhere. This is why this has been a focus of my research. So on that note, I want to end my presentation by pointing out that the oppression of the Baha'is in Iran has resulted in a global diaspora of Iranian Baha'is, some of whom, of course, are living among us in Bellingham. At Western, where I work, there are currently about a dozen Iranian Baha'i students who fled the country in response to varying degrees of violence, oppression, and limits on their life opportunities. Some of them are in this room tonight. I want to mention just two of these Iranian Baha'i students at Western to put a human face on what I've been saying. The first is a student named Pega, who I'm an advisor for. Pega couldn't be with us tonight due to other obligations, but she asked me to tell her story. This past May, Pega's cousin, who you see on this slide, was taken from his home in the middle of the night and was tortured for 2 weeks while his family was given no information about his whereabouts. The only reason for this was that he was pursuing higher education within the decentralized Baha'i university I referred to earlier, because he had already been shut out of the country's own system of higher education. But some years before Daniel Luigi was arrested, Pega's father was expelled from university for being Baha'i, and Pega's mother was expelled from high school for the same reason. And Pega's grandfather, who you see here, was put inside a stack of tires and burned alive, merely for his beliefs. And when Pega turned 15, her family had to flee the country so that she could pursue an education, which is why she's at Western. But this is just the story of one Baha'i family. The second Western student I want to mention, her name is Diba, who also asked me to tell her story. Diba's mother was imprisoned for 7 months, during which she was repeatedly tortured. Diba's uncle, who you see here, was also arrested at the same time and received a 3-year prison sentence. Diba and her mother later fled the country, but her uncle stayed, was released for prison. After some years went by, he was re-arrested just this year and received a 4-year sentence for the crime of teaching engineering courses to Bahais. He's still in prison today and likely will be for several more years. Now, both Diba and Pega, if they were in Iran today, would be unable to pursue higher education because it would be considered a crime. There are other Iranian Baha'is in the audience who face exactly the same fate. This is what it means to be a Baha'i in Iran today. Now imagine enrolling in a university where your university orientation includes guidance on what to do if you're arrested for studying. This is what the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education has to do. This is what Baha'i youth in Iran face today. So my hope is that some of you might raise your voices and appeal for justice not only on behalf of the Baha'is in Iran, but on behalf of the universal right to education. A right which I think it's worth noting is being threatened in our own country in different ways. Higher education is being massively defunded right now in this country, not coincidentally at exactly the same time as this country is turning increasingly brown in its complexion. I think that's not a coincidence. So, I'd like to end my comments now with just a few more slides showing the faces of a few other Baha'is who have been imprisoned or killed in recent years. There are many, many more slides I could show, but these few are sufficient to help us, I think, see the humanity of the people we're talking about tonight. People who have been willing to make tremendous sacrifices, in some cases the ultimate sacrifice, for the cause of the oneness of humanity. So I'll play these slides, and you can just watch them quietly, and afterwards we'll have time for comments and questions. So if there are any comments, please feel free. If there are questions, I'll do my best to answer them. There is a microphone for those of you down below. If you could raise your hand and speak into that. For those of you up above, there's a microphone on the staircase.
A question. In your knowledge, have the Iranians used another form of oppression, which is to try to convert Baha'i children to Shia Islam through madrasas, for example?
To my knowledge, there have not been Baha'i children forced into religious indoctrination of the kind you're talking about. But what I do know is that when Baha'i children go to schools, they frequently encounter textbooks that are hostile to their faith, classroom instruction that's hostile to their faith. Their friends are often told by teachers and administrators not to associate with them. At some schools, they can't drink out of the same water fountains as the other students. And so these are the nature of the experiences they have in school. But I'm not aware of Baha'i children being forced into the kind of education you're talking about. Maybe also there are a number of Iranians here in the audience. I want to invite them to speak or address any of these comments if they have additional knowledge or insight about any of these things.
I'm just shocked by the number of young women who have been executed for teaching children. That's mind-boggling, and it seems to be something that they're trying to oppress those that are most motivated to teach the young people. Can you make any comments regarding especially the young people?
Well, one thing I can tell you is this young woman was 17 years old when she was hung. Along with 10 other women who were hung the same evening, all for the crime of educating Baha'i children. So, I'm not sure, I don't know that I can add much more into the sort of psychology behind what would lead anyone to do that to another human being, other than what I said earlier, which is that the leadership of the sort of particular narrow brand of Shia Islam that currently dominates in Iran feels existentially threatened by the existence of the Baha'i community. And they have resorted to, I think, things that most of us find unimaginable. And I can give you other examples of, I think, equally heinous things, in some of the executions that have occurred under this regime. After the execution was over, the authorities would go to the surviving spouse and demand repayment for the bullets used in the execution. So these are the types of things that have actually been happening in very sort of frequent and stable ways. And if you go back deeper into the 150 years of persecutions and look at some of the earlier sort of forms of ways in which Baha'is lost their lives, they're really some of the most sort of brutal things you can imagine that could be done to a human body. So, and again, this is not in any way a reflection on Iranian culture, Iranian people, or Islam. This is a reflection on a very perverted, small power elite in that country that has really held the reins of power or been influential with those who have held the reins of power for many, many, many years.
I was noticing somewhat of a pattern in your slides, so I was wondering if it actually is a pattern that exists, that people were executed for teaching the children but imprisoned for teaching university students, and I was wondering what that was about.
Probably not a specific pattern. You know, the general experience has been in the 80s, shortly after the revolution. There was a wave of execution that happened very quickly. About 200 Baha'is were rounded up and executed in a space of about 10 years for various purposes. Most of these young women who were involved in educating children were part of that sort of early cohort of executions. Others were executed for other purposes around that same time, or on other pretexts around that same time. What happened in response to that first wave of executions, which was accompanied by many other things, you know, Baha'is losing their property and all these different things. Like, for instance, I can't remember if I mentioned Pega, the student who lost her grandfather and all these other things. Her house was set on fire on 2 different occasions. So all these other things were happening. But there was very quickly an international sort of outcry against what was happening, because even in those early days, many outside observers knew enough about the Baha'is to recognize their innocence and were moved to appeal for justice on their behalf. So the United Nations, various parliaments and congresses around the world, Amnesty International, and others very quickly mounted a campaign to sort of express their concern with the Iranian authorities. The executions, by and large, started to sort of trickle off. And it was at that time then that the authorities began to find other nonviolent measures. I mean, there's still a lot of violence used. There's been a lot of torture in prison and other things like that. But by nonviolent, I'm referring to, so there came a point, so for instance, it was about that time when the executions started trickling off that the authorities started expelling Baha'is from universities and barring their future entrance, started confiscating their property, fired all Baha'is who were working in any way for the civil service, for the state, for, educational institutions, removed the pensions of elderly Baha'is, took properties, confiscated businesses, revoked business licenses, all of these sort of nonviolent measures to try and block the progress of the community, try and intimidate Baha'is into leaving their faith, and other methods. So the mix of slides you've seen, my intention was just to provide a sort of sample of some of the ages and types of consequences that this community has experienced.
If one were to look at the laws on the books in Iran, would you see laws specifically stating Baha'i, or are these acts done, are they in some sort of pretext?
You see 2 things. First, when the Iranian Constitution was drafted after 1979, the new and improved Iranian Constitution, Baha'is were specifically excluded from groups that were identified as having civic rights. So Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, Christians, Jews, Zoroasters, which are all the major faiths in Iran, except for the Baha'is, which is actually the largest religious minority there, all the other faiths were recognized in the Constitution as being accorded civil rights, and the Baha'is were very deliberately excluded from that. And since that time then, various religious edicts have been issued, for instance, declaring Baha'is unprotected infidels in various ways. Now, you probably would need a legal scholar, an Iranian legal scholar, to dig much more deeply than what I've just offered, but that's the gist of what's happened. So it's their exclusion from protection in the Constitution, and then the sort of gradual construction of a system of religious edicts and other things that works in concert in this way. There's also, I can add, a document that was discovered by the United Nations. It's actually, if you follow the links on this handout, you can get to see the original and a translated version of it. A document of the Supreme Council in Iran specifically laying out their strategy to block the progress of the Iranian Baha'i community. So in that case, it's more of an executive order that is supportive of the persecution.
I'll have a second question. Is there a due process that ends in these imprisonments and executions, or is it coming in the night too?
There is no due process for Baha'is in Iran. Sometimes when they're brought in front of a court of law, they're essentially given a chance to recant, and if they don't, the sentence is handed out, or they're tortured in an effort to get them to recant, and if they don't, again. So I'll give you one example of due process, or the lack thereof. About 3 years ago, the Baha'is have this democratic administrative system. I won't get into the details of it. It's quite a unique and interesting system. Democracy without competition, to put it in a nutshell. And in Baha'i communities all over the world, they erect this system in order to coordinate their internal affairs. It doesn't interfere with the laws of the land or anything like that. It's purely a sort of internal matter. And after the '79 revolution, the 9 members of that elected institution, none of whom sought to be elected, no one seeks election in the Baha'i community, there's no system of nomination, candidature. The 9 elected members were among the first who were rounded up and executed, members of the National Assembly. The Baha'is had another election, and those 9 were rounded up and executed. And they had another election. I believe those 9 disappeared, and nobody knows, but I mean, one assumes they're executed. So then the Iranian government passed a law outlawing the Baha'i administrative system in Iran. And because the Baha'is are obedient to the laws of the lands in which they live, they dismantled their own administrative system and continued their affairs in much more informal ways. Part of that informal system was there were 7 individuals who were appointed basically to serve as well as they could in an informal way to deal with the sort of minimal needs of this persecuted Baha'i community. And they were arrested about 3 years ago. And Shireen Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Laureate, the only Muslim woman in the world to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, is a lawyer in Iran. She actually received her Peace Prize for the work she's done in Iran, championing various human rights and cases. Shireen Ebadi, this Nobel laureate, took on the case of these 7 Baha'is who were arrested. Partly as a result of that, she had to flee the country. Her staff member was arrested for trying to defend the Baha'is. And those 7 Baha'is were given 20-year sentences. As a result of a huge international outcry, again, the United Nations and various other governments and so forth, those 20-year sentences were reduced to 10-year sentences. And those 7 are still in prison under quite horrible conditions. Some of you might have heard about a year or 2 ago, a young Iranian, Japanese, American named Saberi, Roxana Saberi. She was a reporter who went into Iran to do some documentary work there. She was arrested and imprisoned. She spent time with 2 of the members of these 7 I'm talking about who were women in the same prison, in the same cell with her. She's shared some very, very powerful observations about her experience with those 2 women that you might be interested, but none of them received due process. None of the Baha'is have received due process in Iran.
So why haven't they made it illegal to be Baha'i?
Well, that's a good question. They essentially have, but there's a point at which obedience to the laws of the land has limits. And those have to do, according to Baha'is, with matters of personal conscience. When one isn't interfering or organizing in formal ways, but is merely living according to their conscience, then Baha'is draw the line at that point and say, no, no government can take that away from us. There's actually another thing that falls within that line for Baha'is, something that governments can't take away, which is the education of their children and youth. They will not cede that right, which is considered a universal human right in every declaration and covenant that has come out of the United Nations that touches on that theme. It's a human right that Iran itself is a signatory to. But that doesn't uphold in the case of Baha'is because they don't recognize them, essentially, as human beings worthy of protection under the law. So there are limits to obedience to the law.